Добро вечер, гледате Клик Плюс, јас сум Боријан Јовановски. Вечерашен мој гостин е Дармендра Канани, директор за стратешки политики во think tank-от Пријатели на Европа, Friends of Europe, еден од најголемите и највлијателни think tank-ови или невладини организации, граѓански европски организации со седиште во Брисел, кои редовно веќе со децени ги третираат или даваат можност да се дебатираат да секаде во Европа за теми кои се можне важни за сегашноста и иднината на европската конструкција. Имам чест во студиото да е вечерва со мене еден од главните и водечки луѓе на ова организација. Welcome and it's a pleasure to have you in my program.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be invited. Thank you for making the time for me.
Well, talking about the European Union, this is an issue which were a few years ago, let's say 10 years ago, was very nice issue to talk about it. Became a bit, frustrating to talk about EU, or the prospect of EU, of the prospect of enlargement, because since Prespa agreement with everybody, all European leaders promised to us that we are going to start negotiation, we are still stuck. In June, it's the 5th anniversary of signing the famous Prespa agreement. So, as somebody who is in charge of strategy of an organization dedicated to stimulate the European, let's say, debate, what would be your suggestion how to restart the idea about European future in our country?
I think, you put it really well, Boria, that it's a case of asking for people to be patient at a level and a basis which is unjustified. It's an unfulfilled promise to leaders of the Western Balkans, and who, like in North Macedonia, did so much to fulfill the promise, and yet they're still left where they were and where they have been. And I think there's a palpable sense amongst leaders and ambassadors from the Western Balkans that is it really worth it any longer? Now, from our perspective, what we're trying to do is we're calling this a new Balkan journey. Accession is treated as an exam. It's a game of who's the fittest to join the club. It's about meritocracy. It doesn't seem to come across as if it's about values and the European project. And each of the Balkan states have reciprocated. They've followed suit. And what we believe should happen is that, good democracy, good governance, independent justice system, keeping young people with skills and abilities in the region, making sure women get empowered to get proper jobs, and making sure you digitalize your economies and create an internal economy should be good for the Western Balkans regardless. So I think the debate should be restarted rather than from a point of view of glass half empty, each of the Balkan countries, to collaborate, unite, and actually say glass half full. And we will do this regardless, rather than leaders fulfilling an administrative book and jumping through hoops. Because when we think about it, at the end of the day, look at Poland and Hungary in the EU club, as well as others. You wouldn't say that they meet the values of the European Union.
It looks like that, yes, you're right.
Yet, all of you are being treated in a way that is unfair. I think it's unjust. And actually, at one level, I think it's unethical. And the reason why I say that is that accession has been interpreted as a policy objective, as I said, to simply about enlargement. Whereas from our perspective, the way we change the debate is about saying, how do you extend the European project. This beautiful idea that came about to say, we will never do this again. We will never have war again in the way that we have witnessed it. And we'll create a union. We'll create an internal market, but fundamentally, it'll be human rights, universal rights that underpin us, and we'll extend the project. And we've seen it extended. The mistake, the strategic mistake that's been made by the European Union, and I have to say by the successive commissioners, and I'll say this absolutely bluntly, successive commissioners being in charge of enlargement, haven't really got a grip of the potential and the opportunity of the Western Balkans. And we are now today left with the consequences of that short-sightedness.
And now,
the Ukraine situation.
Instead of dealing with the, let's say, values, you maybe have to deal with the problems again in the region, having in mind that those unfulfilled promises open a huge space for a populist and nationalist that remind us from the very ugly period of late 80s and beginning of 90s in what happened
Indeed.
back then in former Yugoslavia. So what now? Because, you know, I'm not sure that on the next electoral round,
Yes.
the pro-European agenda will be so popular
Indeed.
as it used to be.
Yeah, Borja, I think there's everything to lose and everything to win. Today, I heard from the president when I met him that the highest reduction we've seen in a sense of affiliation and a desire to be part of the EU is now witnessed in North Macedonia. I also met civil society organizations who said that people's faith in government and their sense of how corrupt governments are the highest and the lowest they've ever been, even when there was state capture. That says a lot. So you have this nexus of being disappointed by the EU not letting you in and making you dance and giving you false promises, and a population that's saying, we don't believe that those who govern us are going to be straight and not corrupt. So you've got a dynamic taking place here which could be very damaging across the Balkans. I don't think it's being witnessed across the Balkans. What I do know is that research in most Balkan states which suggests that young people don't trust their leaders. And these are the young people who are walking. So I think what needs to happen is that Europe needs to take a different approach to the Balkans, stop making each country jump a hoop, treat the Western Balkans as a bloc. And I think if they were to do that, we'd get a different outcome. But to your point, the reality is, we're talking about countries that have experienced a history which is very different to the rest of Europe to a certain extent in terms of communism. These are relatively new states, but the issue is, and this is something that was said to me today by one of the meetings I had, is that before you knew the top of the tree was taking money, but then when everyone else sees that actually a politician is going to feed himself first before feeding the nation, the rest of the nation thinks, why don't we just feed ourselves too? And that's a negative dynamic that's taking place.
Our belief was that if we start the negotiations, it will be kind of the road, kind of a direction in which our politicians are going to be strongly monitored, and that they will be obliged to change their attitude towards something and to leave some custom politics, internal, and personal gain, and lucrative politics. But instead, we still, being stuck without starting negotiation, and watching the example of some other countries in the Western Balkans, like Serbia, Montenegro, pretending that, or both sides pretending that they're negotiating something, but the very same situation is very present in both countries, Montenegro and Serbia. So, what's the idea?
It's the worst example of both political behavior on both sides. This is not just in the Western Balkans, also in the European Union. It's the worst example of a missed opportunity of trying to safeguard the eastern flank of Europe and create a new community, if you like. And it's the worst example of politics as it is conducted at the moment. You know, when you watch politics across the world, and this is not just about the Western world, you go to your parliament, you go to any parliament in the world, you'll be very, very, you'll be misplaced, or rather you find it very difficult to find one that doesn't feel like theatre. People are play acting, they're creating, basically, they're throwing bats at each other and balls at each other, and it becomes theatre. It's not about governing. It's not about what are the important issues to people in the street, to you, me, and those watching this show who are thinking, okay, when are these two sitting prime minister and the opposition going to talk about housing stock? What are they going to do about talking about what they're doing about unemployment? How are they going to solve digitalization in the Western Balkans? We don't get that conversation. What we have is a drama and theatre. And I think the reason why I'm here and tomorrow is that we're going to introduce this concept of constructive politics. Now, to some, it'll seem as if it's just namby-pamby left-wing crap, but it's not. Because what we're trying to do is say, we've been through the worst health crisis in history so far. We've had a financial crisis that's really buggered us up. We now have a war that's created an energy crisis. And suddenly, we have been asked as communities, but also politicians, to do the right thing, behave differently.
It's a high time.
Absolutely,
in a way.
absolutely. So really, crisis has raised the bar to a certain extent. And what we're saying is, I think there's a generation behind you, me, Borjan, and even these camera crew people who are much older in their 20s. I'm talking about those who are growing up as teenagers and will be active citizens in the next 10 years who will have a very different approach to politics and political behavior. And if we don't want to lose them, I think we need to start the art of constructive politics.
Well, in June, there will be the 20 years since the famous Thessaloniki summit, when the European leaders promised that Western Balkan will become part of Europe. 20 years ago. Nothing happened in time. And now the main frustration is talking for citizens, and especially those who used to believe very much in European future, is that there is no political will within European Union to enlarge. So what should we do in order to
Excuse me.
impose our European interests highly on the agenda of European leaders?
I think,
I mean,
yeah, I mean, look, I think Ukraine, you think to yourself that given what happened with Ukraine, that suddenly there'll be a wake-up call about what the Western Balkans represents. Not simply just from a security perspective, but thinking actually, how do we protect this ideal of EU, this idea of universality, human rights, etc., and also economic growth? Why would we leave it open to illiberal forces, undemocratic forces, and those to influence right in your neighborhood when you could actually extend the project? And I think what's the shame about this is that what we've done is, and rightly so, say Ukraine should be brought in. What's missing in this is strategic thinking at the highest level of the European Commission to say, how do we treat the Western Balkans as a bloc, as our new frontier for peace, our new frontier for economic growth, but also make sure we ward off the forces of illiberalism and autocracy. You can only do that if you're forthright and forceful and decisive. Now, what needs to happen at the other end is that the likes of, the 6 or 7 prime ministers need to come together and say, actually, together and united, we'd be really very powerful in terms of being able to negotiate a different kind of deal. Why don't we suggest a different model of engagement? Stop putting us through individually let's think about you as us as a collective, and actually let's make sure we work with the EU to create a different kind of approach to extension based on a different value set, but to say the Western Balkans will be treated as a bloc as a whole, but then but the Union the Commission would have to be committed enough to say, we will work hard at this. And at the moment, I'm afraid what we've seen is how the Western Balkans are treated, especially from, let's say, when people think of the ambassadorial post or the civil service post, it's like thinking, oh dear, it's not the sexiest post to get. It's not for, career civil servants. But that should be turned around. It should, and this is not to do a disservice to all those good people who are here and those ambassadors who are here. But the governments need to turn that around and make Western Balkans a place that is really interesting. It's highly desirous for a number of reasons, but actually infighting and division is creating the negative outcome. And I think that if the leaders came together and said, we've got fantastic tourism potential, we've got natural resources, we can create all sorts of opportunities for inward investment, and we've got skilled labour, we could do something really quite creative. That's what I would do.
Oh, well, but let me ask you, you're coming from Brussels.
I am indeed.
The headquarters of your organization is in Brussels, in European part of Brussels. So, what's your feeling as an insider? Do we talk about enlargement at all?
I think enlargement is spoken about as something which has to be thought about in the long term. It's not seen as a policy file that everyone's attracted to. People constantly look behind and say, look what happened when we brought the others in. And actually, do we want to grow it even larger? So it's that kind of sense that some of the ones who have been successful in the club are being unfair completely. But I go back to my point. I think collectively, they're not being strategic about what you represent here in the Western Balkans for the future of peace, security and defense, but also economic growth. So I think what needs to happen is that you need to have a movement on both sides. And I think when you make the point, it's been some 10, 15 years, lots of money. Imagine if there was an audit of how much money has gone into the Western Balkans. What's the return for you, your children or family, etc., in terms of change?
The result is a raise of the Euroscepticism.
Indeed.
And the negative attitude towards the European Union.
Indeed. And what a waste of opportunity. I think...
What a waste of opportunity, money, time.
Indeed. But the thing is, what we said that when COVID hit us, that we would change. Sometimes we would actually connect with each other more. The banging on the streets, people felt a sense of community and thought, wow, this will never go back to normal. The worry is that when the Ukraine war started, everybody, I suppose, the big experts thought it would never happen, even though there was intelligence to suggest, probably 8 months before, that this was definitely a dead cert. We're not changing our behaviour, and by we, I mean the Union, the European Union, the European project, and I say this all due respect because I think they've done a brilliant job in the COVID crisis. I think they've created the biggest capital innovation through the Recovery and Resilience Fund. You've had some real creativity and they've moved with speed to joint procurement, everything. But what I don't understand is the short-sightedness of the current administration, the current commissioner and the group of commissioners, and together with NATO and others to think actually Western Balkans represent an opportunity. They should be brought in, loved up, and seen as part of our new frontier towards the east. Because actually, if you're going to wait, what you'll end up doing is they'll realize that others, malevolent forces from the east or the south, in the Middle East, etc., will be in there. And there already are. And we know that.
Everybody who's coming here is saying that, Balkan is belonging to Europe, it's a huge potential, but, everything. But then still we are, running, in the very same place. Now, it's clear that European Union has a difficulty to function with so many member states within the framework of the Lisbon Treaty. But then also we can't see any movement, any serious initiative saying, well, we should change the Lisbon Treaty in order to make places for the newcomers. So in the meantime, we have to make a new, exception to Bulgaria now, to change the constitution. Why to start the negotiation? The political party who will go to the election and present to themselves as a pro-European in the next election, saying we should change the constitution again because we want to start the negotiation process. So the voters will say, well,
why?
It's not. I mean, what's your
the point of it? Because this will be the third time you change something and get nowhere. So if I was a voter here, I would definitely not buy your ticket.
Yeah.
So, but I think that goes back to the issue of, look, it works that the leaders here, the Western Balkans, will sometimes agree and disagree or play games with each other. And that means sometimes that the EU has the opportunity to behave in a way that creates meritocracy in the system. And I think the way to turn that around is twofold. I think it's both sides. I think both sides need to play differently. The deck is ahead of us. The world, as you can see, is right in front of us. Both sides need to do the right thing. Western Balkans need to come together as leaders and say, enough. How much can I swallow to be able to come together and say, I can create a different kind of structure? And actually I can create an agreement to say, treat us differently and we'll work with you. In the European Commission side, I think you need a different bloc mentality. You need to be able to say what I've said before, Western Balkans represent an opportunity for peace, security and growth, and the eastern frontier for Europe in terms of the value-based project. Now, that has to give. That's what needs to be changed. Otherwise, I think you'll find is that politicians will continue to play the political game. And when you come, what disappoints me is that our cycle every 4 years means that look for someone who wants to go beyond that and actually do something meaningful that might change the course of history for both sides. And that's what we need. We need that level of commitment and authenticity and integrity to say, it's almost like you need like one of those days where you say, we're going to cut the crap. Let's sit down, spend 2 weeks or a week and actually sorting this out. But that's not how we do politics.
Let me ask you about your organization as one of the most prominent and biggest European think tank, non-governmental organization in charge of, let's say, promoting the debate of Europe. Rarely we can see on your agenda the enlargement issue, or Balkan issues. I mean, why so?
Well,
I mean, but
no, I won't be. Well,
I guess it's not interesting for your guests. Usually you have a high, high-ranked guest speakers.
Let me disabuse you. Your research is wrong, my friend. I'm very sorry. We have we have created something called the New Balkan Journey.
Yeah,
and
okay. I'll ask you about the
project. Two years ago, we've ratcheted up the importance of that. And the one reason was when I took over, when I watched our Balkan summit, everything inside me felt like we are treating the Balkans like the EU does, which is through a lens of half empty, missing the point, needs to play by the rules of the game, and very much a kind of an agenda of not seeing opportunity, but only seeing failure. And I wanted to stop that. I said, we're not going to do this. And so we created this New Balkan Journey, which is based on, as I say,
I'll be back for the project. I'll be back. But let me be more precise.
Yeah.
I know your debate in your house. I mean, you can have all the president of the European Commission, the prime ministers, the president of the countries, the member state of the EU. Why? I mean, maybe there was a long time ago in France, but remind me, to invite the Commissioner for Enlargement, the President of the Commission, some of the Balkans leaders, and then to see them on the same place, on the same panel, and I'm curious to listen to such a debate and to get these answers that we both looking for. What's
I'll send
wrong?
you. Okay.
What's wrong?
Okay.
I mean, when the both sides are so eager to, to enlarge, to integrate, to join Europe, or EU and the Western Balkans, but at the same time, nothing is happening.
No. Let me be clear. Both sides aren't keen, right? What I'm saying is both sides are missing a strategic opportunity.
Yeah,
right?
We know.
Absolutely,
yeah, but
right?
Why not to expose them? I mean,
exactly.
Me as a media, I can't have the von der Leyen and the Rama and Vucic and to discuss with it. But you, as the First of Europe, you can.
And we did.
Yeah.
So I'll send you a video that's coming out next week. So last December, we had Rama, we had the Prime Minister of Montenegro, and we had your president all on the same panel. All for the first time coming together the day after the Tirana EU Western Balkans Summit.
I know.
So you know. So it's not a case of we don't think it's that. Unfortunately, none of the commissioners were available.
Yeah, I know.
They were invited.
The question is whether they were not available or not willing to
I can't second guess.
appear there because they have nothing to say.
Potentially, but I can't second guess that. They were invited. But no, I wanted to make sure you realize that we do. I mean, our strategy is twofold: to make sure we have high-profile events.
I
in
follow
December.
you closely.
But what we do, no, I'm not being defensive. What I think is important is that we're not sitting in Brussels pontificating about something we don't know. So what we've done is we've spent twice a year, we come into the region and run and work with women on our Women's Economic Empowerment Working Group. So we've been hosted by mayors, about 4 cities so far. Next one will be back into Tirana this September, and then we're going to come back here. So we've been trying to make sure that we're not operating a think tank that does stuff in the Balkans from Brussels. We're actually hosting these in the region, thanks to politicians and entrepreneurs who are enabling us to do that. But then, once a year, we bring that all back into Brussels and say, what's going on? And we were very surprised that we got all three. We got the two prime ministers and the head of state and the president. And, if you watch the video, if you watch them, it was a sense of what a sunny side situation could look like. They were
very much so.
They felt optimistic. They had a good session.
Them, by the way.
And then you think everything goes back to normal. And they must. I feel for them in the sense that thinking it's almost going to edge forward, and then suddenly the Commission says, "Well, yeah."
Let me ask you about your project that you mentioned, Balkan Journey, mainly oriented towards women and youth.
No, and alternative leadership.
Alternative leadership.
Yeah. So what we're looking at is women's economic empowerment, because we think if you get that right, it will seed economic growth in the Balkans. Let's deal with the disaffection of young people in the Balkans. We know they're leaving by droves, but actually, when you survey them, that if you got the politics right and the opportunity right, and actually made agreements to travel between, they'd stay potentially. And when we're not doing that,
When
we're
you
not
survey
creating.
them, in the case of our country especially, it's horrifying because the huge percentage of the young people have a very, very conservative ideas, which is surprising, but that's the fact.
You have to look at longitudinally. That's changed over the past 5 years to 10 years, that kind of figure. But I think that's also to do with how this country's been treated in the past 5. But you can see what we want to do is what kind of incentives could the Balkan leaders create to keep young people in the Balkans, but also to create kind of some freedom of movement, but also Erasmus, different types of Erasmus programs with EU countries. What kind of stuff could you do to really create better incentives for startups, for young people and women? It's entirely possible. It's entirely possible. And if I challenge anyone that's who hasn't been, if you go to Pristina, if you go to Tirana, you come here, you go to other cities of the Western Balkans, you can smell the opportunity. You can smell the sense of growth. You can see there's young entrepreneurs who really want to rebuild their cities. The leaders need to get their acts together and actually behave in a way that enables that community and generation of young people to stay and make it work in their cities. Because the cities are equivalent to you could just imagine that some of these cities are going to be the places people want to come to in the next 10 years if the right thing is done. So
it's nice what you're saying. Well, I agree. There are a lot of opportunities in this country, in this region, although with many challenges, having in mind the corruption, the inefficiency of the public administration, etc., etc. But on the other hand, the young people here are, in a way, you can say blind, but they can't see any opportunities anymore.
But that's what did we talk about earlier? If you believe your leader is going hand to mouth, not to you, you're going to say, well, how am I going to trust that? So there's the opportunity or the failure that we have here, not only in the Western Balkans, but elsewhere in Europe and the world, is, are you prepared to behave differently, better, with integrity and purpose? And remember that you are at the service of a taxpayer who pays your salary. Yeah, remember public service. We don't talk about public service. When was the last time you talked about public service with a leader? And they're like, there's a sense of entitlement that leaders think that I need 3 cars, I need all of this, etc. and so forth. But no, the political challenge you offer, we offer, should be about going back to the basics of what is the social purpose of politics. And I think we need to be able to craft a different kind of politics, constructive politics. But I think, if you speak to young people across your region, and I've had the opportunity to speak to many, and every year we bring about 50 to 60 people, online about 100, at our summit. And there's that thing about wanting politics to be better. They would like to stay. If they had the opportunity. But also, the other thing is, loneliness is the biggest 21st century malady. People want to be asked to help and want to engage. And I think that we could create a very different dynamic in the Balkans if we were to help and work with young people to not only say, will you help, but here's the incentive to stay, and not make it punitive.
Well, one of the biggest problems that we are facing, it's a global problem, the huge polarization between, let's say, progressive and conservatives, or we can define many other ways, okay? And we will agree on all. One of the core value of your project, Balkan Journey, is to help, the political structure in the Balkans, here in Macedonia, also to find a way and to go out of this, labyrinth of the polarization. What's the aim? What's your methodology? How you can help us?
I don't think we should be arrogant, and I shouldn't answer that question and say to you, I think we can help you this way. That's wrong. It's I am not just being twee and fey about it.
What's your methodology?
I don't think we should. No. The method. I'm saying to you what I think. What should happen here within the Balkans is that you have opportunity sitting in front of your face. What needs to shift is the political game, and there's a political game that's taking place that needs to change its habits and its purpose and its direction. If it does that, you'll deal with the extreme polarities, because polarities come about when the center and the main leave the room.
What's the methodology of the project, let's say, to offer some common ground in which the different parties from the different sides there is a huge gap. What's the common ground you can offer to them to start finding a proper way of conversation?
Absolutely. The fact that we need to have this constructive engagement, constructive politics, starts with the ability of bringing together large groups of citizens with politicians to talk about daily livelihoods, and rather not just make promises about young people being the future of the Balkans, or women are really important. Actually talk about the hard realities of what it is to live, work, play, have well-being, to be able to have a family, be in a community, feel rewarded and be rewarding in different ways, and feeling a sense of well-being, have that conversation with citizens. Find a modality, find a way. You could have, imagine having a massive citizens' assembly across the Western Balkans. Put all your leaders in there and talk about actually how are you going to answer that question that she wants a better bus route in the rural area. She wants access to the land that her partner says he's put in her name, but she can't exercise her right. He wants to have a startup loan, but actually can't get access to it because it's too risky, etc. and so forth. Here are older people who'd like to have a care home. How can we create a different model of care home within the Balkans? I would create a democratic engagement process in the Balkans and be bold about it.
So what's the action plan of your project?
How do you mean, what's the action plan?
What are you going to do?
So what are we going to do? So for the Women's Economic Empowerment
to reach the goal that you define as a goal, you know?
So for us, we're going to come together and create this year, this autumn, a set of choices for governments, a set of policy choices for governments in the Western Balkans about how do you improve the economic empowerment? It's not just economic development, economic empowerment of women and girls. What do you do in the schooling system is this. What might you do in a community might be this. How do you change regulation, or how do you create regulation that women can exercise their rights better? How do you create a level playing field for access to capital and even in being involved in entrepreneurial activity, etc. and so forth. So what we want to do is not try and come up with saying you need more women in politics. Good thing to do. We're not going to say actually you need a balance there. What we're saying is make it matter by acting like it makes it matter. By that what we mean is create the opportunities in schools for girls to believe in themselves and create that sense of balance within the school. Change the legislation so you know that you are making sure companies and public sector are treating fairly, equally and with equity both men and boys in what their outcomes are.
You are going to work with the Ministry of Education for this?
Absolutely.
Go school by school?
No, school by school.
People.
No. We're going to try and persuade education
I'm curious
ministers. I'm just
find out the methodology and how you will approach, whom you will approach.
So every time we meet as a group, we send our recommendations of the working group to every Prime Minister and President in the Western Balkans. So they know what we're talking about. When we produce these 10 choices, they will go to anyone that's relevant. So if it's an education piece, we'll send it to every education minister. If it's a justice thing, we'll send it to every justice minister. But what we want to do is kickstart a conversation about empowerment of women, but also more importantly, how do you get a better sense of self-belief in the Western Balkans that it's good to be good just for your own sake, not just because you need to be part of the EU. And that's what we're trying to do here, is saying that if you were to create good governance, good democracy, a good education system, create housing for young people, the only people that will benefit at the end of the day are people who are citizens who are living in the Western Balkans. That's who will benefit. And what politicians need to focus on directly is, how do I use my term of office and mean public office and a public service, create the inward investment, create the opportunity to make sure I'm looking from cradle to grave of the communities I'm serving.
Okay, but what you're saying is, however, based on some, philosophy, some concept founded on, let's say, European or Western values, if I may say. At the same time, we're dealing with a society in which, I'm sure you know, the Russian leader Putin is very popular. People supporting Russia in this brutal aggression in Ukraine. So, you see this.
Borian, you can't do this. You're a media commentator.
I'm not doing
you
whatsoever.
Okay, look. Okay, let me challenge you. I know.
I'm challenging.
Yeah, I know, but I'm challenging you back. No, I'm challenging you back.
Reality.
Borian, I'm challenging you back. You know the state of the media in Russia. You know what the state is. It's not people believing. You know what? There's a complete lockdown in the way there is in China.
It's easy
so we
to
cannot
talk,
say.
to talk
but
with me. I know what's Russian media.
Exactly. So to say that, well, Russia's doing doing this, etc. What we need to think about is, we know that's happening. That is happening, absolutely. But, you know, look at Serbia. Look at the state ownership of media in Serbia.
Yeah.
That has to change. That absolutely has to change. How do you do that as a community? When we think about what's happening in terms of the role of law, I mean, let's say in terms of a rule of law, let's create a different architecture for rule of law in the Western Balkans. It is entirely possible. All I'm saying is, if you have this sense of ambition to be better and say, you know what, I'm not going to simply just have 4 years of being on TV, make sure I'm doing the right things, I'm being effective in criticizing you, I'm playing in the theatre, and basta, it's over. Those days of politics have to change, is what I'm saying. And that might be naive, it might be romantic, but I think it's entirely possible. And I think young people want that.
I absolutely agree with you. My question is how? That's, I mean, a simple question.
I think we should try different ways of engaging people. Cultivate, create, as I said, create a citizens' assembly across the Western Balkans. See what happens. See if one leader is prepared to say, I will bring young and old around the table.
That's maybe a good idea. Okay, that's a good answer.
And have a conversation.
Do you think that we could make it?
Yes.
Citizens' Assembly in the
Absolutely.
Western Balkans?
Yes, absolutely.
Who is going to, let's say, Friends of Europe will initiate it?
No, we shouldn't initiate
okay,
it. No,
cool.
that would be wrong,
Yeah,
because then
okay.
we're an outsider in that way,
okay,
you know.
okay.
What we can say is recommend it. But your television company could be a co-host for it. You could go to Eddie Rum, you could go to Steve, you could go to others and say, how about this idea? Why don't we just actually take the bull by the horns and create a different opportunity for engagement? We've had this, you know, conference on the future of Europe, which has really gone into the Western Balkans. Let's create our own opportunity to engage with citizens so that we tackle radicalization, polarity, and actually the fact that we feel out of touch.
I am impressed by your idea, including this one that our TV could start such an idea, but in the meantime we have to struggle with the survival.
Sure.
But okay, that's for another program, okay? So, one last
There
question.
are many millionaires in the Western Balkans, I'm sure you could speak to.
Yeah, there are many millionaires, we know. And
there's
we know
also-
also how many of them and how they become a billionaire.
Indeed. But then you get, you know, you've got also some very, 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 very popular artists. There are ways in which, how do you cultivate that growing generation of young people who are making songs, making films, doing theatre, making drama, setting up businesses? Cultivate them.
Talking before about the EU, that was my point. EU is not dealing with people. EU is dealing with the institution. Sometimes playing and politics of. It was very used in the Brussels corridors. Stabilocracy, pretending to be okay with the leader. We know he's corrupt. We know he's nationalist. We know he's also involved in many. But so far he's preserving for us a stability that we need in the Balkans. So
that's what needs to be changed. I don't think it's just the Western Balkans. You know, if you think about the portrait of the 21st century and the last century, you have this sense of, it's mostly men that have been in leadership powers, let's face it. Only in the past 20 years we've seen a real change taking place in the representation and the engagement of women. And we've seen 2 big leaders also resign in these first 6 months, 3 months of this year. But there's this portrait almost in my mind of men with their fingers crossed behind their back like this, looking at each other and smiling. And basically, they all know what they're doing. It's almost like the biggest self-confidence trick that you can think of. And what we need to do is change that. The only way you change the norm of how politics is done and how, in particular, male politicians, not all of them, majority of them behave, is to create a dynamic of direct engagement with citizens.
Yeah, that sounds nice. What's the last question? What's the future of Europe in the framework of this brutal war in Ukraine?
I think, I mean, I'm not an expert. I think there are many people who are much wiser.
You are a European
am.
thinker, let's say.
Yes, we're a think tank that thinks about this. I think one of the things, and I meant that what I said, I think one of the things has to be about how do you turn enlargement from being an enlargement project into an EU values project. I think that has to be a key, serious consideration for the future security, peace and growth of the eastern flank of Europe. I think that energy is going to, unfortunately, if we don't ramp up renewables, and create the opportunities to create alternative supply chains, I think politicians, and this is what we talk about political behavior, when people have to make a choice between fuel and food, right? And you're a politician in a constituency, suddenly those horrible images of people dying in Ukraine go like this. And what will happen is the sense of commitment, wanting to do something will soon vanish. So I think one of the issues, one of the challenges, the risks that we need to manage is how do you almost take the kind of approach we did to COVID in terms of the vaccine. International crisis, we need to do something really quickly. Energy crisis, international, it could have vast consequences. Come together and create a very different approach to how do you produce renewables and clean energy. The third thing, I think, is digitalization. I think it's going to come and whack us in the face before we know it. You and I have no idea what's happening beneath the surface of digitalization and digital entrepreneurialism in terms of what is possible right now. And I think it changes the art of warfare. It's going to change this conversation, for sure, and it's going to change how we won't need any of this, but also the fact that how we consume and live in our streets. And I think we need to, rather than wake up to that reality, manage it more carefully. But I think that in terms of the very specific issues, I think that we need, and controversial as it may be, I think we need to have a review and an overhaul of what we mean by multilateralism. You know, we have many institutions, and I'm not criticizing them for not having done their job. But until we are able to look up and say, how are you reflecting the world we're living in right now? That's changed faster than any time, any period in history. You are not alive to the realities of what's happening in future generations. And, you know, at the moment, how does the World Trade Organization deal with digitalization of currencies and digital economies? We don't know yet. How is it dealing with the divisions that are happening geopolitically across the world? We need to think differently.
We're going back in the bipolar world?
No.
After this war?
I think it won't be a polar world. I think those days are gone. I think that's just a fascination of the West that want to create some sort of political currency about, you know, warfare and foreign affairs. It's a nonsense. It hasn't been bipolar for a very long time if you think about globalization. What I'm saying is that we need to think about multilateralism being different. And we need to think about the fact that we might want to create regionalization of multilateralism. You know, India is going to have the largest middle class in the world in the next 3 years. That's going to have an impact on Europe and the Balkans.
As many other challenges.
Exactly. And Nigeria is going to be the most populous country in the world.
Yeah.
You know, most populous country in the world in the next 10 years. So it's about saying we need to change our approach to multilateralism and think about it differently. And you know what? Some of the Western Balkan leaders could create their own multilateral institution in the Western Balkans.
Let's try. Mr. Darmendra Kanani, thank you for being part of our program.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Това беше все, почитувани гледачи. Ви благодарам за вниманието и до гледане.